Well, Joseph Parker has another big fight on his hands this weekend against Dillian Whyte, a massive hitter. And joining me now, I'm going to call you the foremost boxing or combat sport analyst we've got in New Zealand, which is why we've got you in. Mike Angove, Dillian Whyte, first of all. A lot of New Zealanders won't know too much about him. Just give us a little bit of background about him.
I think what we will know about him is how he went against Anthony Joshua. We know he rocked him in the second. We know he hurt him to the body on a couple of occasions. We also know about the Chisora fight and the pre-match antics and the bitterness in there. Similarly, there were scuffles ahead of the AJ fight. So we know that Dillian Whyte is a guy who fires on emotion. He's controversial. He'll talk up a fight. And he's the kind of man who will always go out on a shield.
Does he back up his lip? Because he's been doing a lot of talk saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. How much of that is bluster and how much does he believe?
Look, this guy genuinely believes. He's dangerous at all stages of the fight. He's got proven powers of recovery and he believes he can always find a way to win. He's the kind of guy who you say in boxing parlance, he's dangerous even when he's got a broken arm. He's improved a lot, particularly under coach Mark Tibbs, who he's had since after the AJ fight. We saw that most recently against Lucas Brown, where he really took Lucas to task. So, look, he is a guy who is legitimately inside or there or thereabouts the sort of top sort of 6, 7, maybe even 5 in the world. He's yet to take that step into the top echelon, and that's also a step that Joseph Parker needs to take coming into this fight.
So, what's his strengths? What does he bring as a fighter? What's his threats?
Well, he's fueled by emotion. He's a guy who likes to needle, likes to get under his opponent's skin. But what he brings, apart from genuine punching power, particularly with the left hook, is intensity. He's going to push the pace of the fight consistently. He will be on you. He will cramp Joe for room. He will try and back him up to the ropes. What perhaps a lot of people don't see is he's a good counterpuncher. He will take a shot on the left side of his gloves and come back with a left hook. He does read people quite well, and he's a good infighter. So he's not just a bollocking brute. He has some good skill. He's a little bit slow. He can overbalance at times, which is something Joe will obviously want to capitalise on. But most importantly is the intensity and self-belief of this guy. He thinks he can drag Joe into a brawl and break him against the ropes, and that will be a lot of Dillian Whyte's game plan for this, or Dillian Whyte rather.
What about his endurance? Has he got the gas tank to go the whole distance?
Look, I've been watching a lot of his conditioning recently. He's doing a lot of work in the gym, a lot conditioning-wise. Where he can fade is, he tends to throw 120% into all his shots, so he can tire. But again, you have to revert back to genuine dogfights that Whyte has had and also Joe has had. Dillian Whyte's been in dogfights and he's proven he has the ability to recover and find a second wind in between rounds. Probably the closest thing Joe's had to a dogfight was Carlos Takam. Admittedly, he had a sore back at the time, but even there, I felt he was sort of marginally ahead. But that's the only time we've really had to see Joe show mongrel. Dillian Whyte shows mongrel in every fight.
So Joseph Parker, importance of this fight, I'm prepared to say I think this is almost more important than the AJ fight now. Now that the AJ fight's been and he lost it. If he lost this one as well, I just see him tumbling down that ladder. In your mind, how important is this fight for Joe?
Look, I think both their careers are in the balance. It's a risk for both fighters. For Joe, if he loses, it will do much more damage to his brand than it would if Whyte were to lose. Whyte's brand is actually established as the mouthy guy who makes the fight, who sells the fight, and comes to fight, but a guy who should be beaten. Remember, he had a split decision win over Chisora, and Chisora is that guy in the division who could never quite crack the top echelon. He got beaten by Klitschko, beaten by Hay, slapped around by Tyson Fury twice, and also in 2016 was beaten by Pulev. So, he's a guy who Dillian Whyte managed to scrape past. Whyte's next fight was against Hellenius, and again, he got past him comfortably, but Hellenius isn't a fighter who sets the world on fire. So you have that benchmark of where Whyte is. Joe needs to be able to get over these very tough and torrid tests to prove he is, I guess, the top echelon, the dark horse in the division. Recently, there was a picture on Ring magazine where they had Tyson Fury, they had AJ, they had Deontay, and they had Joe as the dark horse. Now, this is a fight that proves he needs to be, or proves he's worthy of being in that company.
And I guess we're going to see. So, I feel like Joe waved his flag quite brightly even in that loss against Joshua. I think he showed some qualities. But this is his chance, or this is our chance to see how he copes with that extra pressure. He knows there's pressure on this fight.
Look, and how he responds to that pressure is pretty critical. How you take a loss and come back from a loss is perhaps the most defining aspects of what makes a fighter and an athlete in general. He says he's learnt from the fight. They would have taken confidence from his defence and his movement out of that fight. They would have been annoyed that he wasn't able to turn that into offence, so counter-attack when he made a miss, for example. Also, there were obvious things that, he didn't have a plan B when the speed started to wane. He didn't vary up his leads or feint effectively instead of just going in and punching long with the double jab. Different fight, of course, against Whyte, but he has to show what he's learnt from that fight. The obvious criticism was he didn't go out on a shield. He didn't throw it all on the line. Again, different fight because it wasn't so much all on the line. Even though the world titles were on the line there, I think this is a career-making or breaking fight. The AJ fight, I think he still had a lifeline if he went the distance, if he was the first guy to go the distance. So, this has a lot more imperative, a lot more urgency coming into this fight, and we need to see Joe handle that pressure well, not come in and blaze away like a crazy man. That's not going to win him this fight. He needs to have the urgency and intensity, but be very, very smart about it. I guess cold fury over sort of white-hot anger.
Nice, I like that. So style-wise, how do they match up? I mean, Joe, as long as we've known him, has the vaunted speed. And he's got good power in his hands, and his defence has been a little bit weak, going straight back, all that sort of stuff. How do they match up stylistically?
So I think their strengths and weaknesses match up really well, which is why you have such an even divide amongst boxing analysts and experts. When you set aside the obvious country bias, people are finding it very hard to pick. Whyte is a guy who pressures, he comes forward, he cramps punches, and that's something that traditionally Joe struggled with a little. Against Ruiz and Takama are the obvious examples. But by contrast, Whyte tends to overthrow at times. He tends to be a little bit loose. He's vulnerable to counter himself. He's also not the faster fighter, and Joe is far quicker than him. And, so there are clear strengths and weaknesses there that actually match up well to make this a really intriguing fight. Whyte's the harder hitter of the two. If Joe has enough room to get his hand acceleration off, his power is underrated. So, there's a lot of intricacies, if you like, to this fight that make it really intriguing.
Do you back Kevin Barry's tactical nous to devise a game plan and hopefully a B plan midway through the fight if the game plan's not working? Do you back his technical nous?
Kevin's a very, very experienced trainer. I know he puts a lot of work into developing strategies. He takes a lot of advice on board externally from within the camp. So that's something that I think that they do very well. Mid-fight, if there is a criticism, maybe it's not necessarily the strategy, but it's having the one or two key words to get it through to the fighter of how he needs to change or adapt. And sometimes that can just be take a step to your right or bigger body feint as opposed to a hand feint, for example. Just subtleties that Joe needs to get through to hear and to make the adaptation. That's probably the key learning for the camp in terms of coaching stuff. What do you do midway through a fight? How do you adapt when that pressure's coming on? I know KB, I know him well. He does see a fight well. He does visualize it well. Sometimes it's just communicating that in a way that he hears. But I will say that Joe trusts what his corner has to say, and that's critical in any relationship. So it's just about picking the right moments when you're forced to adapt, and small adjustments that can make a huge difference in a tight fight.
Bookmakers have found it very hard to split this. I know there's a couple have got Whyte as favourite. Most of them have Parker as favourite, but just by the narrowest of margins. It's almost a coin flip type fight. And even in the method of victory, the favoured way is actually Parker by decision, and the second favoured way is Whyte by decision. And you'd think with two heavyweights, the favoured ways would be knockouts.
Well, look, everyone wants a knockout because you're not paid by the hour, and particularly not in heavyweight boxing. But I mean, it's indicative of two very evenly matched fighters and with two very evenly matched styles. I mean, to me, this fight comes down to a few key facets. First is, how does Joe handle the mental needling up front? Whyte calling him a coward, Whyte saying, Higgins is not here to talk for you. Whyte saying, don't leave your running shoes. Don't bring your running shoes, rather. So he's trying to goad him into a stand and deliver. If Joe can overcome that, then the actual key once they're in the ring is, can Whyte adapt to Joe's speed? Is his speed too much for him? And can Joe actually dictate the pace from the outside and basically pot shot him and break him down? That's a big if, because Joe's a very fast fighter. I talked to Brian Minto earlier on this week, and he said Joe's the fastest guy he's faced, both in the heavyweight and the cruiserweights. So, critical factor. The next point is, can Whyte adapt to that speed? If he can, then it's Joe's turn to adapt, because Whyte's actually a very skilled counterpuncher. He hits back on the same side. He moves his head well, particularly with single shots. He's a guy who counterpunches well and tries to catch you in between punches. So if Whyte can adapt to the speed, then can Joe adapt to the counterpunching, and how does he work that? For example, maybe double up on the jab, keep it low at the chest, make sure he's using really good, believable feints to try and counter the counter. If Joe then adapts to that, then the real strategic chess match starts, which is, can they handle the pressure? Can Joe handle the pressure? Can he continue to dictate the fight from the outside? And conditioning then starts to come in. And once you get into that conditioning factor late in the fight, depending on who's banked the rounds early or are they close, then it's that will to win. Who actually has the intensity and the burning desire to win? And often when you're getting down the stretch, remembering these 12-round fights are marathons, they're not sprints, that's pretty key. It's, who has the burning desire to find that extra punch and not sit on their laurels. And that's somewhere where probably Whyte has shown greater desperation in the past, and that's an area that Joe needs to pick up. So a lot of machinations in this fight before we get to the end of the fight in the 12th round.
Well, Mike Angove, I feel a bit unfair asking you this, because there's pluses and minuses for both fighters, but I'm not going to stake your reputation on this, but if there was a gun to your head and you had to say who and by what method, where do you think is the most likely outcome?
Okay, before I answer that question, I'll give you some of the feedback I've had from some of the experts. Lucas Brown, the guy who Whyte fought last, sees this as a 50-50 fight with Joe having the edge in speed. Glenn Macquarie, who's a former BSYB commentator and former IBF world champion, Parker has the edge in speed. He thinks Parker should win on paper, but Dillian Whyte's intensity could be a factor if it goes late in the fight. Peter Fury, obviously Tyson Fury's trainer, and he also trained Huey Fury, his son, to fight Joe, knows the guys really well. He favours Parker with his hand speed, but be aware of Dillian Whyte's power. Brian Minto, who's fought them both, thinks, again, 50-50 fight, but Parker should have the edge in speed. So, you've got guys who are really sitting on the fence, as am I. I think Parker's speed will probably be too much for Whyte. He'll bank early rounds. If Whyte can't handle that speed, I expect maybe a late round stoppage from Joe. If Whyte can handle the speed, then Whyte's intensity and power comes in, and then it really comes down to how well can Joe fight off the back foot, and that becomes Whyte's fight. So I'm staying firmly sitting on the fence, but as a Kiwi, I'll favour Joe. How was that for a long-winded answer?
That's great. Mike Angove, thanks for your insights.
No problem.